Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Trey Schaefer. I'm a senior partner with Environmental Resources Management, and I spend most of my time focused on the topics of sustainability and climate for the oil and gas sector. As part of its sustainability journey, SPE founded Gaia nearly a year ago in collaboration with many, including IPECA, IOGP, OGCI, and our sister society, AAPG. Its basic premise is to help ensure that the oil and gas industry comes out on the right side of history, valued for our contributions, yet agile and imaginative enough to evolve with changing expectations of our role in society. At our first Gaia Summit in France during the summer of 2019, which seems like a lifetime ago, 55 of us began to co-create a sustainability blueprint that will mobilize the individuals in the oil and gas industry. One of the many outcomes of that effort was a collaboration between SPE and OGCI to create a series of dialogues between thought leaders on climate change in the oil and gas industry and the broader oil and gas community around the world. Our aim was to deepen the understanding around issues of climate change and receive feedback from the wider oil and gas industry on the energy transition. We planned a series of these dialogues over 2020 with global scope, and we'll be discussing other topics like CCUS and collaborative action, among others. Our discussion today will focus on methane emissions in the oil and gas industry value chain and how industry is responding, the need for ongoing response and innovation going forward, and also as we look toward the need for methane reduction and decarbonization, we see a number of challenges ahead. Our initial collaboration has expanded, and today SPE, OGCI, IOGP, and IEA, as well as Darcy Spady, a past SPE president representing Carbon Connect International, have come together to form our panel. And my distinguished guests include Julian Perez, the Vice President of Strategy and Policy at OGCI Climate Investments, Tim Gould, the Head of Division for the World Energy Outlook and Investment at IEA, Wendy Brown, the Environment Director at IOGP, and then again, Darcy Spady, Managing Partner for Carbon Connect International. And really to kick this thing off today, we'd like to set the stage with a fundamental question. Why is methane emission reduction a priority for the oil and gas industry?
Thanks for the question. I think I'm going to jump in first. The little guy who has spent some time in the SP world and is very thankful that we're discussing this. Quite honestly, as a former SP president, this is an incredible day, and I can't be happier than the group of panelists I'm surrounded by. But the biggest issue, why is this a priority? It's 25 times worse than CO2 from a global warming perspective. So methane is super important. It's an easy win. The technology exists. Everything we are trying to fix in the space, or most things we're trying to fix, we installed. We know where they are. And then we have the added benefit of completion technology. You know, who's been thinking about temporary installations like post-frac flowbacks and things like this? So I think it's a great, easy start that we can demonstrate to the world that we're serious about climate things in general. We don't want to debate. We want to fix problems that are easy to fix. And with pressure from financial institutions, from the public, we have a chance to really come out of the gate strong, have some solid, easy wins, and do a lot of good for the planet. That's how I'd answer the first question of why it's a priority.
Thanks, Darcy. I think you bring a unique perspective as a petroleum engineer.
Maybe I can chip in as Tim Gould from the International Energy Agency. Certainly agree with everything that Darcy said. I think this should be considered an easy win. We should also remember that the oil and gas sector isn't the only source of methane emissions. It's not the only source of sort of man-made methane emissions, but it might be the one that's easiest to mitigate. Unlike CO2, so methane has commercial value, so any methane that's captured can be monetized, and we have to recognize that that's probably easier to do in the oil and gas sector than elsewhere in the energy sector. And it's probably easier in the energy sector than it is in agriculture, which is the other main source of anthropogenic methane emissions. So the oil and gas has an opportunity because the emissions reductions here can result in economic savings, can be realized at lower cost. And of course, it's a critically important element of the future of these liquids and gases in the global energy system.
Thank you, Tim.
I'll contribute now. Hello, everyone. For me, it's simple. Two main reasons. As Darcy and Tim have just said, it's the right thing to do for the planet. And the second, the credibility of gas as a solution for the energy transition depends on our ability to tackle methane emissions. So that's undoubtedly one of the most important reasons. The role of gas is challenged worldwide, and convincing people that gas is no better and even worse than coal because of methane. So we need to really tackle the methane emissions, even though, as Tim has said, oil and gas emissions represent a relatively small part of the overall methane emissions, of the order of 12%. It's something that we can do it, and we have to do it. So it is very important for our industry.
If I may jump in as well, just to also complete what my colleagues say, and I feel very humble to speak right after all of them. I think maybe in addition to what was said, the saving potential on methane and the consequences of the temperature increase could be quite summarized as well by the fact that as of today, methane is estimated to be responsible of the quarter of the temperature increase that we experience. So it's quite an important greenhouse gas that has been roughly neglected, I think, in most of the case for the past decades because it was less known than the CO2. So the attention was less important on methane. But now we realize that we can make a lot of saving on that, particularly because you can reduce the stock of methane present in the atmosphere by playing on the flow, considering that the lifetime of methane is relatively short compared to CO2. So by playing on the flow, you can reduce the stock relatively easily, and so you can address a quarter of the issue in a very quick manner. And it's true that the oil and gas industry has clearly a role to play. It represents a portion of the issue, but a portion that can be addressed and fixed because the technology is there, and because probably the sources of methane in the oil and gas industry are certainly concentrated across a very small number of big emitters. So in terms of a cost-efficient analysis, make you quickly conclude that this is the things to address.
That's a really interesting point, Julian, that there's a few things that we can do, not everything, that can make a big shift and a big change. Thanks for adding that perspective. We've been seeing quite a number of really ambitious announcements coming in from oil and gas companies. Various CEOs are making public statements, and it's sort of an exciting time for the industry in terms of the intent of these statements of ambition. And thinking about methane reduction specifically, as opposed to, let's say, a compliance activity, is the pace of change coming along fast enough for the sector in light of all the pressure that we're seeing from society and from investors?
Maybe I can say a couple of words on that. I certainly agree it's an exciting time. There are some very interesting commitments being made, some quite far-reaching commitments being made. But from our perspective, from the International Energy Agency, we see that the overall pace of change is still well short of what is potentially available and what would be needed to really tackle climate change. So around 80 million tons a year in our estimation of methane leaks, methane emissions from oil and gas operations. So we reckon that around 75% of that could be technically possible to abate. And more than 40% of that total, we think could be abated at no net cost. So like the value of the captured methane will be higher than the abatement measure. And in our view, there's still a lot of work to do to really ingrain that culture of methane abatement into company operations in the same way that you've seen for safety over many decades. Now, the good news is, and this you can see from some of the leading companies, that when companies focus on it, they've shown that it's possible to get these emissions down. They've found that it's very cost effective. They've typically found that it's easier and cheaper than they had anticipated up front. But there is that wide spectrum of performance across the industry. Some are doing very well, but I have to say that there are others who are simply not paying as much attention to this issue. There's governance issues, there's operational practices. And so the issue is not just about raising standards among the best, just to get attention to this from across the whole spectrum of industry actors. And that, I think, is a crucial challenge. It's one that we've been talking with OGCI about. How do you focus not just on your own performance, but how do you really spread those best practices across the industry as a whole?
That's such a great point.
Well, I'll jump in. I'm thrilled to be in a jurisdiction in Alberta where we're leading the way. I know there's other jurisdictions on Earth, but one thing I'm seeing is through the practice of methane measurement and emission, we get very good at what we're doing and the costs come down. So all of a sudden you're leaving 1 or 2% of more gas in the sales line, and you're breeding technology, developing technology in a very cost-effective space with lots of little participants, which I might add is good for COVID because it means lots of little contractors on the ground doing lots of little things. So it's really good to be in a jurisdiction that's practicing, because as we learn, we can roll it out to the rest of the globe. As you referred to, Tim, in your comments, that it's not just the leaders, but everybody has to do it. But it's coming, it's easy, it's cost effective, and it's there. So I think there's a really bright future in the rollout part.
Yeah, and if I can maybe come in here, we've been collecting data for the last 20 years from our members, and we see big differences in different regions of the world. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, for example, Europe, the methane intensity is about half of what we see, at the global level. And we also see, big differences between different members. I mean, overall, I would say that the pace of change is probably not fast enough. I think everything our industry is doing, is really commended. But at the global level, we really need to step up the pace and drive improvement across the whole industry. Yeah. And I think there are some real pockets of good practice, as you would say. There's some excellent examples. And I think if you look at the IEA methane tracker, there's some fantastic examples there where, for example, you take Norway, where their numbers were 24 times higher than they actually were, and they came in, they showed all the good work that they were doing, and obviously some of our members, particularly the OGCI companies, that they do have a very good level of performance, and we just need to really make sure that we get that level extended across the whole industry. So, there's a lot of efforts ongoing to try and achieve that, but yeah, there's a lot of work to be done still.
Trey, I'll just comment on the OGCI side, but as Wendy highlighted, our companies are starting from quite low, because if you look at the methane intensity over the gas that is delivered to the market, we emit 0.32% in 2017 of methane, and they have committed collectively to reach 0.25 by 2025, and potentially 0.2, which is our ambition. So if you translate that into a slope or a trend of reduction, that means a reduction from 1/5 to 1/3. And as Tim highlighted, we try to expand this intensity as some kind of a good practice standard that we would like other companies to look at. So if the rest of the industry was doing the same as we do, we estimate that the saving could be roughly around 25 million tons of methane assisted with the ambition. And that translates, if you take the global warming potential of 30 roughly, that means nearly 1 gigaton of CO2 saving potential. And the world is emitting 50, to make a rounded figure. Tim, under your control. Again, I feel very humbled to speak about figure in front of the IEA, but that's roughly speaking the range of figure. So that's a big saving potential, and that's why also we engage with a number of players outside of the value chain, but also with countries for them to set up those targets ahead and give basically the direction of travel that each of us will have to follow in the next few years to make that happen.
Getting a handle on O&M to, as a real driver for making a dent in the reduction of methane emissions. But I think it might even go a little further back in the design, starting from the design into the O&M, there's a lot of opportunity. And we're, what are the things we're seeing that are going to be making a shift in that sort of dimension? For example, why are we still designing facilities that have known methane emitters in terms of the equipment that we know it already? Why does that continue to happen? What's the driver for that?
Well, I think one driver is to know where the emissions come from, and there is a need to improve the quality of the information of where the emission happen, because most of the time the methane emission are associated with leaks, and so being able to detect where the emission come from is probably the first step, and then you can fix them. So you can act on things that you can measure and that you can So I think that's probably one thing where the technology improvement helped a lot, because we have been equipped by the market with a number of new technology in the past recent years, and those are working pretty well. So I'm pretty sure that this is going to happen in the next, the next few years. We're probably going to see a change in trends in that domain.
Thank you all. I was going to follow up with another question related to near-term priorities for the industry, kind of following on from that discussion. So what are the top near-term priorities, and what can the industry do to make a step change in methane emission reduction?
Okay, well, thanks, Trey. I'll have a go at that. I think it's a massive subject, and we could spend a long time. I'm just going to maybe highlight three main areas that I think could be key to this. I think the first one, and we've touched on it a little bit already, but is improvement of data accuracy. Now, as Julien said, and I think Tim, there's high uncertainty in the numbers, and essentially a robust, fit-for-purpose monitoring, reporting, verification of methane emissions is what we need, and we need that to provide consistent, transparent emissions data from all the companies emitting. So that's the number one, without a doubt, and we can talk more about that. There's a number of things ongoing and started, which will help. Number two is if companies can all follow the methane emissions best practices. And here I'm going to give a shout out to the Methane Guiding Principles Best Practices Toolkit. If all the companies were following all those best practices, that would be a fantastic start as well. And they include, all the different areas from flaring, pneumatic devices, and of course, leak detection and repair. And the third is to establish methane emissions targets. So I think those three, if all the companies really worked on following those, that could make a real step change in the industry. So we can certainly talk in more detail about all of those. But that, I would say, I don't know what you others think on that, but those are my three top recommendations.
Maybe I can say a couple of words on this, Trey, because it struck me that we're all agreeing that this is an opportunity. Mm-hmm. That really begs the question about, well, why isn't it happening then? If there is an opportunity here, if it delivers these benefits, if a lot of it can be cost effective, then what's the problem in a sense to address this? And I think a few things that we probably need to be aware of, and many of them dovetail with what Wendy was just saying. It could be a lack of information about the problems, or a lack of measurement, lack of awareness about emissions levels, or the cost effectiveness of action. Sometimes it's an infrastructure issue. You have a saturated local market that makes it difficult to match your additional gas to a productive use. but often you just don't get the incentives in place. It could be the competition for capital within the company, or it could be insufficiently quick perceptions of payback periods, also because you're not valuing that climate benefit from methane, or you have these split incentives where the owner of the equipment doesn't directly benefit from reducing leaks, or the owner of the gas infrastructure doesn't see its full value. So in a sense, tackling some of those barriers is also going to be important. But as it's been said, there are ways of doing that. And so, it's really a question of building up that momentum. And in our view, there is a role for well-designed regulation. I mean, coming from Canada, you know that very well. That's an interesting area for many countries, including in Europe, to be looking at.
That's excellent.
Trey, I'm going to jump in with a comment, two comments. One is the importance of baseline. I mean, part of what we in our organization like to call MEM is methane measurement and mitigation. So before we measure it, before we have that baseline, we're kind of wandering around talking about things, but it's so important to get that baseline and understand the measurement, and then we mitigate. But I just want to reach out to all the more average petroleum engineer SPE members that are maybe probably not on this call. And we have so many bad practices. To Wendy's point number 2 about best practices, how many times in the drilling and completion world did we see in the procedure vent to atmosphere? Who's the guy on the valve bar blowing back the whatever to the sky? These are practices that us old geezers did for years and years in the field. We can't do them anymore. And so I think part of the step change is the younger generation understands that the comment vent to atmosphere or blow down as a procedure is unacceptable. We have to put that gas, that effluent, that emission, we have to put it somewhere. And that is part of the change of the greater body of SPE members. Like, no, you don't vent to atmosphere. That is incorrect. So there's a psychological change to Wendy's point number 2 as well.
I was thinking as I was listening to Wendy that, we're talking about, I think we're talking in this context about actual measurement, not in terms of compliance reporting, which may not be an actual measurement. So how are we going to shift from, let's say, a compliance mentality to an actual measurement mentality and knowing what our baseline is?
I mean, Wendy provided a good example of, there's been a number of interesting measurement campaigns that have taken place in Norway. There's been a number in North America. That is just essential information. By and large, when you start to have real readings about methane emissions, you do understand that those desktop calculations based on emissions factors, they can be off by a considerable amount. That said, some of the new data that's becoming available, particularly from aerial measurements and even satellite data, that's going to introduce a lot of transparency into this picture, particularly for some of the larger intermittent but very significant leaks. So there are new sources of data that will become available that will show which jurisdictions and which companies are paying attention to this issue, and in a sense where the laggards are as well. So in a sense there is transparency coming, and it's in the interest of companies, it's the interest of companies of countries to know that there will be a light shined on where those leaks are taking place.
And that's an interesting point, sort of the democratization of information and the information relative to society. But it also probably points to something else that you were talking about, is the democratization of information within companies, so that the engineers and the people that are trying to solve these problems understand what's happening, so that they can begin to make the changes needed on the design stage, on the O&M, on the design front, O&M, and the various, let's say, stages of the life cycle of an asset. Does anybody else have a comment on this particular topic?
If I may try, just to echo what Tim was saying, I think there is clearly the emission factor were built on very old data, and the need to introduce the technology, capacity to have a better understanding of where the emission are happening or where the continuous emission could happen, and so progressively as well, improve those bottom-up versus top-down approach, and close the gap progressively, because there will be a need also for the very small producer, and I'm thinking of the Permian, for instance, where they may not have the capacity to have a drone campaign on a regular basis or LDAR campaign on a regular basis. But if by the technology and if by having an approach where we compare what the measurement offer and what the emission or the engineering calculation can do, and close those gaps and get very much more precise approach, that would definitely help as well the industry to progressively change the mindset, as you said, and tackle the issue, and also having the country to set up the appropriate standards for the industry to follow, and so have a better control, etc., etc. So it's really like we're really on the edge of changing the approach on methane, because we realize that this is an important topic, but also at the same time we have the technology that is appearing and that enable us to tackle it in a much more meaningful way.
Convincing internal managers about making these investments. And I think one of the underlying issues there is, integrating, cost of carbon into your business planning would be a one way to shift it, because obviously that's going to be a factor if you're integrating some cost of carbon into the business case.
I think the bankers are going to make it really easy, because the people who fund the banks are saying they're the general population, and they're saying, people, we need to think about the environment. So Mr. Banker or Ms. Banker, you're not giving a loan to this oil company unless they can account for carbon. So I think the world is changing very rapidly. And from a business case, if companies start realizing, when I was shipping gas, you'd get the monthly reports and they had a column called shrinkage. And that was a whole bunch of different things, including, facilities, costs and losses and this and that. Well, I'd bet 2% of that shrinkage was methane that was vented. That's 2% more sales gas net in the line. So there is a business case. We have to start thinking about it.
I was just going to follow on from what Julien said in terms of all the new technologies that are coming in. And okay, they may be expensive initially, but we're seeing in some countries operators collaborating together, and sharing facilities. Like you said, it may not be possible for everyone to have their own drone or satellite aircraft. There are definitely opportunities there for collaboration in different regions, and that's something that we're seeing and we're encouraging. And in the Netherlands, for example, they've done campaigns over the whole region, and set massive 50% reduction targets. So I think you need to be working in coordination with others and in collaboration to make things as economical as possible.
Can I just chip in to say that if you do start to introduce a price on carbon or a price on carbon equivalents, which many companies say that they're doing as they screen projects and so on, but in some jurisdictions it's mandated by regulation. Then the other bit of the methane chain that is currently kind of non-economic, that quickly becomes economic. If you have a price of $15 a ton of CO2, pretty much all of that 75% that's technically abatable, becomes an economic proposition. And so, that if you look at all of the different ways in which you can abate emissions and you put them all on a sort of methane is among the cheapest way to deliver emissions across the whole spectrum of energy-related emissions. That's why it also needs to be a priority from a policy perspective.
I wanted to see if I could introduce another question, thinking longer term about policy, regulation, and detection and measurement. And I'm just curious to get your thoughts on key areas that should be given special attention by the industry to move the methane reduction needle even further. We've sort of been touching at it a little bit, but are there, what have we not covered that would be worth discussing?
Yeah, I can start on this one if you allow me, Trey. I think we've touched some of the topic, and the last point made by Tim was very spot on. I believe the one related to regulation is absolutely critical. We definitely need to have regulation tackling specifically methane emission for the oil and gas industry, because you need to get a level playing field and the direction of travel given by the regulator at some stage. So I think that's a very first things that we definitely need to work on, and that's as OGCI we work on with the policymaker. And to do that, that means that you have to get some standards across the industry on how you can address the methane, how you're going to detect and mitigate the methane emission. And there is a number of initiatives that are going on within this space. OGCI is playing in. We work with IPK and OGP to develop a set of recommended practice that could be used as a framework, and then potentially be getting transformed into or inform the policymaker on how things could be done. The methane guiding principle as well are making a tremendous work on this domain, etc., etc. So there is a number of players involved, but that needs, an alignment across the industries and work with the policymaker to set the appropriate standard on detection, mitigation, and then on quantification, reporting, verification, which is the needed level playing field when you have to set up a regulation. And then there is all this work that go on with engagement with the countries that needs to set that up, because when you look at the developed countries, or some of the countries have already a good climate regulation in place or climate framework that enable those methane regulation to be put in place. But actually looking at the other countries where most of the oil and gas industry, most of the oil and gas actually is extracted, taking into consideration Africa, for instance, they may not have this capacity to date, and engaging with those countries and explaining what can be done and to allow them to make the leapfrog toward the appropriate regulation straight away and the appropriate policy is probably something that here again, the group of oil and gas industry like OGCI can do. And then there is the last point I would say where the industry could put their eyes on is obviously what we said earlier, the technology. And what the technology can bring, like between the traditional technology, like the laser or the optical gas imaging, like the infrared camera, or the emerging technologies, like again the aircraft and satellite and others. All those combination of technology could probably bring a lot to the industry, and scaling them up is quite important. Recently, for instance, our investment fund OGCI CI made a major call for projects that is still ongoing. Actually, it's been launched last week, I believe, to make a call for commercial project to happen. And so we're ready to invest in those to scale up and bring to the volume effect. So yeah, focusing on technology is another area where I feel that we can bring a lot.
That's excellent.
I would add to this that I'm blessed to be in a jurisdiction that takes us seriously. In Alberta here, we have a very good regulator that has directives out there that very specifically lay out the flaring, the incinerating, the venting, and the measurement. Our fellow provinces of British Columbia and Saskatchewan do the same. So I'm blessed, but I suddenly have an obligation as an SPE member, as a citizen of the world. We have an obligation to spread that technology globally, and it's groups like my fellow panel members here that are doing such an excellent job of rolling out the best practices to the world. So I'm in a funny space. I'm thankful, but the obligation grows for us to get it out there to everybody else. And it's so important to have a strong regulatory framework that's meaningful and reasonable and practical.
It's interesting, building on a comment that Darcy had made earlier, that bankers are going to make this easier. And I agree with that. The investment community is moving much faster than, let's say, other areas to put pressure and to cause change. But I think this is an interesting point this participant is making. Money moves at the speed of trust. And I know trust is a big issue for the industry. So the question is, how do we become more trustworthy and then be seen to be more trustworthy on the methane emission issue? It's like if you could solve that one, you could probably tie a Gregorian knot. But it's a really fundamental challenge for the industry.
Yeah, I would say by being, having been more robust, accurate, transparent with their data, and setting targets and delivering on those. I think we've come back to that many times, but I think, it's fair to say many of our members participate, either in OGCI or in this oil and gas methane partnership, and they're just bringing in this what they're calling the gold standard, the 2.0 reporting framework, which is very much 5 different levels. And if you work towards the highest levels, 4 and 5, that is very much something that is probably going to be launched this summer, and it's something that a lot of people are being encouraged to sign up to and meet, and this will help the data and the emissions to be much more accurate, and it will involve, as Julien's already touched on, not just the bottom-up estimations and measurements, but also the top-down reconciliation. And I think that will help build the trust, because the top-down will be data collected by others, or it will be data that is sort of cross-checking. So I think all of that will help to build the trust. But I think we're on the right track in for some of this, but there's a way to go for sure.
So SPE is the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and I frequently hear with this society that we know a lot. We know a lot about the geology. We know a lot about the technology that's being deployed to produce these resources. And so I think within the industry, there's a belief that we have a high level of competence in this subject, and there's a relationship between your competence and trust, and it's just getting through the barriers really to have your competence be able to be trusted. I think that's a challenge for the industry, and it's also a situation where we have the need to listen and be very, very intently listening to make sure that we're understanding what we need to do. And I think that's a little bit of a shift, because also we may have a tendency to not listen as carefully. I think that is changing right now significantly. And I think as evidenced, I don't think the CEO statements that I alluded to earlier in one of our initial questions, these are not questions that are, or these are not ambitions that are being stated without intent to fulfill these ambitions. So it's a big opportunity right now for the industry. I wonder if anybody has further thoughts on this.
I do, on the competency and trust. Sorry, Julia and Ian and Tim. As SPE president, I went around to a lot of places, 49 countries uniquely. And I know that Sammy, who's on this broadcast, followed me with the same message. And you meet so many engineers, and you get the question, why don't people listen? We have competency. We know what we're doing. And the answer I gave over and over was, we have to be humans. Stop telling people how smart we are, how good we are, how wonderful we are. Let's be good humans. If you have a chance to have a neighbor that's an engineer, or a neighbor that's an artist or a musician, or some completely different industry, pick that neighbor, because we need to be citizens of Earth, and the world is going to only trust us after 10 or 20 years of being part of them, not apart from them telling how good we are. So competency and trust is a huge issue. We have competency, no problem. We have to earn trust, and sorry to say, it's going to take us 20 more years to get that back.
Maybe I can just add a word on that, because I think we've talked a lot about data, baselines, and these are incredibly important. But just linking that data to trust, we need to be able to show not just that we have a handle on the data, we need to be able to show that that data demonstrates a reduction. And it demonstrates a reduction, this needs to happen within the next few years, because that's the crucial timeline that we're talking about now. This is not a question of building up the competency. We know enough about the problem. We know enough about the technologies. We know enough about the approaches to abatement. And this is really the moment when we have to take sort of credible, demonstrable action on this. And as numerous speakers have said, that should be within the reach of of the competence of the petroleum engineers and other professionals in this industry.
If I may just jump in, I think when it comes to our member companies and the fact that we've set up this baseline and this target and how are confident that we have actually the right data to set up those targets and those baseline, there's multiple things that we're trying to achieve as the technology develop and as the mindset is changing and as we're trying to close this bottom-up and top-down approach that, we deploy campaigns of measure. Our member companies are taking care about that, and they deploy it. And within OGCI, we try to push them to expand the volume of gas that is covered by those type of campaigns. So that's one thing that we work on, and we share knowledge across our member companies. But we have also built up a partnership with Environmental Defense Fund and the Climate Clean Air Coalition to test and try technologies and how accurate the methane emission estimated are versus the technologies, again, to try to close the gap and make sure that we have some kind of a realistic picture, or if not, we can correct it. And lastly, the thing that I think we're also trying to push within the regulation and the monitoring reporting is the part of verification. And I think having a third party coming in and verify that what you say is what you do, and particularly as OGCI, because we have 12 companies and we need to align the reporting methodology across those 12. We hire this kind of services with a third party coming in and checking what we do is what we say, and vice versa. So I think the combination of those actions allow you to increase the accuracy, but as Darcy say, I mean, we have to be humble and we have to be human. The uncertainty is part of the equation. We have to reduce it as the maximum, but we have also to be humble and recognize it.
So as I'm sitting here thinking about this discussion, I before I move on to another question, the bonus question that we were talking about earlier, does anybody have any additional thoughts that you'd like to add? Because it's interesting, some of these questions, I still feel to a certain extent that we're beginning to improve and actually report these data, this baseline data, and there's still a long way to go. One of the questions that we're seeing here is, how good is the data? But that's sort of like a can of worms, and I'm reluctant to sort of open it up. But I think we should maybe talk about it a little bit, because I think we're at a moment when it's improving. And is there any sense of how long it's going to take us to get to the moment when we'll say we've got it? Will we ever be there? I know that's sort of a really broad question, but I'm just curious if we think that there's an end, because at some point people want to see that we've got it. Darcy talked about a timeline of 20 years, and it could be a long time, but 20 years seems like an awfully long time compared to the ambitions that have been announced by various CEOs. And I know you were speaking extemporaneously. Yeah. I'm not really intending me to glue it to this particular line of discussion, but I do think it's going to be a challenge, and it will take some movement by all parties.
Yeah. Well, I would just say that what we've been seeing, I mean, if we even want to link it to the current context with the low oil price, the COVID, the energy transition, all these challenges being faced by our members, and even though they're all having to reduce costs, I would say without a doubt the majority of the companies are still prioritizing work that is reducing their carbon footprint. So I think that they're still prioritizing this sort of this aspect, and they still see the importance of lowering their carbon footprint, and these sort of things are still getting priority. So, and I think, as we said right at the beginning, the fact that it's a short-lived climate, powerful greenhouse gas with very, in the short term, it's something that we have to work on, immediate, in the next 10, 20 years. So, and I think a lot of companies realize that.
Well, you mentioned COVID-19, and that's sort of a very, everybody obviously notices that we're all, coming together, not from our offices, but from our homes. And I'm curious, are we seeing any kind of impact on the low carbon economy transition related to COVID-19, or what are you guys seeing from that standpoint?
Well, I kind of tipped my hand earlier, so I'm going to finish what I said. I think it's great, the methane emission reduction field, the measuring of it. It's a great time, and COVID isn't hindering it because it's a lot of small businesses. These aren't mega projects with crowded sites and lots of people. These are a lot of small technologies, or a guy in an airplane, or a guy with a detection device, or somebody welding something and installing something. And this is a lot of little businesses. This is good for the Permian. This is good for Romania. This is good for Western Canada. It's lots and lots of little small businesses with 1 or 2 people separated by 2 meters and able to wear a mask.
Can I chip in a couple of comments on that? I mean, we recently came out with some analysis on how to build in sustainability to recovery strategies. And one of the aspects that we looked at was precisely this one. So everyone is aware that there are job losses in the oil and gas chain, supply and services in particular. Now, it's possible, as the Canadian example shows, to dedicate some resources as part of your recovery strategy to get those people to work on abandoned or orphan wells or on methane abatement. Now, that seems a very sensible way to marry the employment imperative with the environmental imperative. And on the broader question about whether the pandemic and what does it mean for energy transitions, I think we have to have one overarching thing in mind. Everyone is, I think, aware that CO2 emissions have come down, or are likely to come down quite significantly for the year of 2020. They've come down for all the wrong reasons. So they've come down because of declining economic activity. It's come at a huge human, social, economic cost. If we get emissions into structural decline, we have to change the structure of the energy system. And until we actually focus on those measures, then a rebound in economic activity is going to lead to a rebound in emissions. So let's keep our eyes on the prize there.
Yeah. If I can just echo what Tim was saying about this overarching issue of low carbon transition versus COVID, and then zoom on the methane. So I of course agree with what Tim was saying, and I think actually under your control here, Tim, again, that's basically the potential reduction of CO2 emission that we've seen during the coronavirus crisis and the end of the year will confirm that was, roughly speaking, the trend that has to be followed to reach the 1.5 degree scenario over the next decades. So that show us the level of ambition and the level of transformation that we have to go, and that's why a massive effort from all parties, including the entire oil and gas industry, is definitely needed to make that happen. But that also shows us that the combination of mitigation and technology that allow to capture the CO2 emission and to store them, so the CCUS or the direct air capture or the nature-based solution, have to be part of the equation, because it's going to be tremendously, we're going to probably miss the time to meet that goal if we don't put them into the equation. Now, if I zoom on the methane, I totally agree with and echo again what has been said at the beginning by the panelists. The business case of reducing methane emission is more and more shown. There is a lot of action that could be done at a net negative cost, and so what is good for climate here is good for business as well. So I'm pretty sure that within the recovery, that's not going to be dropped.
Any other COVID-19?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a very difficult question, Trey. I think the impact of COVID on the energy transition, I think it could go either way. I think there are two camps. It could accelerate, it could delay. I think from our industry point of view, the direction is clear. We need to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. That hasn't changed, but it's difficult to predict what will be the impact on the energy transition. I think is this unprecedented situation, as we all know, and oil and gas companies reducing jobs, investments, but we're not the only ones. The entire humanity is affected. So I think it's very difficult to predict, but all I can say is our members, seem very, very committed and very driven towards achieving the Paris Agreement goals. So I think they're very committed to keep focused in that direction.
Well, at the investor level, it's clear that the investors are not sleeping and are continuing to put significant pressure. There's the well-known BlackRock letter that's continued to put pressure on companies and CEOs in particular. And then, of course, Bloomberg has just added quite a number of questions to its some of its benchmarking data sets. So there's remains a very high interest at the investor level, and as capital becomes more and more precious, and the need for capital is not going to go away, companies are going to be responding, and so that's going to create this dynamic that will be ultimately very positive for the industry, because the business case will have to be created. There are going to be some things that companies need to do. I thought we need to wrap our discussion up because we're approaching the hour. And I thought maybe if each of you could offer a 30-second highlight from our discussion today that you want to be absolutely sure. I didn't mention this earlier, but that you want to leave with our audience. What is the one comment that you would leave briefly?
I would jump in and say technology is available. Let's utilize it as oil and gas people.
Yeah, I think, nothing much to add, but we have the solution, so we just had to apply it. So, there's no question and no time to waste.
Yeah, I would support both of those. Come back to, there's a whole host of best practices out there. We can do it. We have to do it, and we just need to get on with it.
I'm gonna fall in line with that. I think it would be difficult in a year or two and have the same discussion. It should be difficult for us to come back in a year or two and have the same discussion. Mm-hmm. We should be able to, industry should be able to put data on the table saying, look, this is where we were, this is where we are today. We're moving, and because there's a sense that that's happening, but it needs to be demonstrable and needs to be backed up by the data that we've talked about.
Well, thank you all. It seems like we were warned that this would go very fast, but it did indeed go very fast. I would like to wrap up by thanking each of you for being here, taking part of your time. Have a great day and stay safe.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.